Hey folks, my name is Forrester, and in this video I'm going to give a demonstration on how I use the Superior Drummer 3 plugin inside of Pro Tools to create a killer drum mix. Now to do that, I've got a session from a band, City of Souls, and it's their song Ferryman, and I've grabbed the stems for the guitars and the keys and the bass, and I've extracted the drum performance from the recorded drum audio and converted it into MIDI here, which we're going to use. And I've done that using the tracker function inside Superior Drummer, which is a super powerful tool for getting MIDI out of your audio. But this video is going to focus on how I go about getting a mix of the drums and making it sound great for the particular song that I'm mixing. So I've got this final preset here, so we'll just have a quick listen to how that sounds in the mix, and then I'll step through how I actually created the preset. So I'm pretty happy with the way that mix is sounding now, and I will add that all the sounds and everything you're hearing are just coming from the Superior Drummer 3 plugin. So I'm not sending any stems out into Pro Tools. I'm not doing any mixing. There's no Pro Tools plugins going on. It's all just coming from the Superior Drummer 3 plugin. It's a really powerful mixing tool. So as you can see, everything's going to outputs 1 and 2 there. So when I get started with a new drum mix, I'll actually go through some of the presets. I find that's a really useful way to sort of work out whether there's a sort of a foundation sound that I can use. They've all got different kit pieces and different balances and different mixes, and it's just a good opportunity to experiment and see what might actually suit the music that I'm trying to mix to. So I'd just go through, grab a loop of a section of the song, and just listen to some of these presets. So make sure you let your kit fully load before you assess whether it's a good sound or not. But I've gone through this process to start off my drum sound, and ended up choosing the attack preset, which I thought was a good sort of foundation, had the right balance of everything that I liked. I have made a few modifications to it, but generally the sound of this kit was feeling right for this song. You want to also make sure that your kit represents the drum performance that you've got. So in the original song, Corey the drummer was playing China cymbal, so I want to make sure that there's a China cymbal in my kit. I've also changed the snare just because I like the sound of this one, and modified one of the crash cymbals as well, again because I preferred the sound. So one of the other really useful functions in this construction window, which I use a lot, is using this instrument level fader just here. So what this actually does is it changes the level of each individual kit piece when it's selected, and turns it up or down in all the microphones. So the reason you can use this, and it's very useful, is that just by nature of different drums and different cymbals, they have different volumes. So when I add a cymbal into a preset, I might find that it's maybe a little bit soft and it's not cutting through. And rather than reaching for the microphones in the mixer page, I can turn, for example, this China, I can turn that up almost 4 dB just so it cuts through and perhaps matches some of the other cymbals that are going on in the preset. So it's very handy to just to do an overall balance of your drum kit in this construction window using that instrument level there. So we can see that snare's turned up 3 dB. That crash is turned up 5. The kick's not really changed, and I don't think the toms change. Also, in this page as well, you can control the tuning of the individual drums as well. So in this instance, I've opted to tune this first floor tom up very slightly, and I've tuned the bottom floor down just a little bit, just to separate them a little bit, but also to match their tuning in with the song so they fit with the tuning of the song, and it just ends up working in the mix a little bit better. So while I'm on the construction page, it's probably a really good opportunity for me to talk about stacking and the stacking function inside Superior Drummer. So when I'm doing regular mixing with recorded drums, I'll often find myself reaching for samples just to enhance the recorded drum sound. I want to add a sample that might add fatness or sustain or crack, one of those characteristics, and it might not be there in the original recording, which is why I'm relying on the samples. Now you can do that really easily with Superior Drummer. So if you right click, you've got your original snare that was chosen into the original preset phase, and then if we go up to more and then add to stack, we can then choose to add any snare drum from our entire Superior Drummer library to that original snare. So for this video, I'm just going to stick to using the Progressive Foundry, which is that library, the SDX that I created with TuneTrack, and there's a great selection of snares there. So what I like to do is throughout the preset creation process is to experiment with different combinations of snares and see if I can add all the characteristics of snare that I like to hear in the final mix. So I'll loop a section of the song and go through and trial a few of these different snares. So you can hear how each of those snares adds a different characteristic, and I go through a process of trial and error to sort of work out which combination of snares I want to add to make the drum sound really pop in the song. And you can see how changing that volume there is super necessary for the different snare sounds, because they all have different volumes and different characteristics that need adjustment. I'll just quickly load the preset again and we can see what the stack was that I ended up choosing. So we've got the original Zildjian snare, and then this one will be a Black Magic, and then Oak Tree. You can see that one's turned down quite a lot, and then Pearl Mahogany. So I like the original Zildjian snare. That was a great starting place. The Black Magic is adding like a bit of crack and a bit of body. The Oak Tree is sort of like a thwack sort of sounds, like it doesn't really have a lot of ring or anything to it. It's just a beefy sort of sound. And the Pearl Mahogany is sort of bringing a natural sort of wooden sound to it. And I like the combination of those four snares. And I've also done the same thing with the kick drum as well. Two different kick drums, two different levels as well. So really useful tool in creating combo drum sounds. I haven't done it with the toms particularly for this song because I feel like they are sounding really good as they are, and often it can be a little bit tricky to get the different tuning of toms to work together in the mix. You may have noticed while I was working on those snare stacks that I'm using this velocity curve, which is a really cool feature I want to draw attention to. So what it's doing is it's modifying the velocity response of, in this instance, the snare stack to reduce the velocities of some of these middle velocity points. And the reason for that is because often when you're stacking up snares together, some of the lower velocities that are used in ghost notes can end up being a little bit too loud, or perhaps due to the nature of the different snares you're using, maybe the wires are a bit more responsive, that some of those ghost notes poke out a little bit more than perhaps they should or would be natural in a normal drum performance. So you use this velocity curve to kind of modify that response and pull them down. Now, if I'll play a section of the song where there's some ghost notes, and I'll disengage the velocity curve, and you can kind of hear how these ghost notes stick out and don't sound realistic. Yeah, I feel like it's just doesn't sound the way a drummer would play it. So if we engage the velocity curve, we can hear how that changes. So to me, that sounds a lot more realistic, and it's a really useful tool, especially when you are changing through different snares. You're using trial and error to get a snare sound and introducing different snares with different responses, and you can just tweak this without having to go in and spend a lot of time adjusting the velocity of the ghost notes for every single snare change you use. So really useful time-saving tool there. I've done something very similar, but almost opposite with the velocity curve for the kick drums. What I've actually done is I've restricted their velocity so that they only play velocities above around about 80. And the reason for this is because of the nature of the music and what the drummer's playing and the double kicking that he's doing. I just want to ensure that all the double kicks and all the kick drums are heard and have their detail and clarity is heard in the mix. So that just ensures that any kick drums that are hit at a lower velocity than 80 are just brought up to that 80 level and are going to be heard in the mix. So again, another useful use of that velocity curve. Now that we've got a good sounding preset built up, we've got some kit pieces changed to match our drummer's performance, worked on a snare sound and a kick sound using the stack function, and maybe tweak some of the pitch of the toms and tweak the velocity curve to get the best sounding performance. Now it's time to head across to the mixer page and think about getting some balances of some microphones and levels. Now, there's a lot of microphones here, and to be honest, I didn't actually tweak these too much. I was quite happy with the way that it sounded from the preset. So there might be some minor adjustments. I think I've added a bit of kick out and changed some of the room levels, but generally left them as they were and didn't really think too much about the EQ and on the individual microphones. What I really focus on to start with is getting all my buses sorted here. So as you can see, all the groups of microphones for the kick drum are bus to the kick bus, snares go to the snare bus, the tom microphones go to the tom bus, so on and so forth. And here it's where I really have the most control over my overall mix. I've got the ability to process each individual instrument here using the plugins and the sends here, and I can do a really quick balance of my overall drum kit here. I've also added a couple of other effects buses here, so a bit of transient for attack of the drums in the mix, reverb, self-explanatory, the black magic I'll go into in a second, and the tape machine is just there for a bit of saturation and warmth in the drums. So let's have a listen to what the processing is doing to the kick drum that I've got here. So you can hear how it's definitely changing the sound of the kick drum. It's really bringing out the attack of the kick drum, a lot of the bottom end as well. So let's have a look at some of those plugins. So we've got the transient plugin, adding a little bit of attack, taking off some of the sustain from that note of the drum. EQ is sort of a typical kick drum EQ, boosting the bottom end, sucking out the mid-range, boosting the top end. But I've got this plugin here, the Punch Exciter 361. I find this really is suited to kick drums. I'll just solo it again and bypass this plugin so you can hear exactly what it's doing. So it's really bringing out that brightness and attack in the kick drum. It's adding a little bit of compression you can hear, but it just really matches quite nicely with kick drums. So I don't reach for EQs as much. I'm not doing drastic EQing to get all that attack and top end out of the kick drum. I'm just getting it from this Punch Exciter, which I think is a really great plugin. There's another EQ on the end there, again, boosting a bit of the really lows and taking a bit of the slap out on the top end. For my snare drum, I've got a significant boost in the bottom end. And the reason for that is that I've got two snares going to this main snare bus. And those two snares are the ones that I really want to bring out the fatness and the thickness in. They're my really full-bodied snares. So I've also added a lot of compression to this snare bus. And again, those fat snares are getting compressed quite a lot. So there's a lot of smack in them. A little bit of the sustain of the note of the snare drum is being brought out with this plugin, so there's a bit more character to the snare and some post EQ as well. Let's just have a listen to what this is doing to change the snare drum sound. So as you can see, a lot of compression. You can really hear it compressing on that snare drum sound, but there's a lot of body being brought in by the EQ. And I feel like that really suits those two snares that I've got sending to that particular bus. The toms have got a little bit of sustain being brought out by the transient plugin, just to bring out the note of that drum, of all those drums, and typical sort of tom EQ, sucking out mid-range and boosting highs and lows. Let's just have a listen to how they sound in the mix. Pretty straightforward, that one. Not really doing a whole lot to the overheads. There's just a bare amount of compression going on. It's only 12% blended in on the mix, and it's a very low threshold, so it's not really doing a whole lot. And EQ, fairly obvious for overhead, sucking out all that nasty sort of frequencies around 3-4K, boosting the highs and taking some of the mid-range out. The room microphones, I like to compress, so we've got an 1176 style compressor here that I'm smashing pretty hard, fast release and medium sort of attack, but a high ratio. And that's sort of just compressing and keeping those room mics sort of nice and even. I also like to use a little bit of reverb on my room microphones, and this is just to add a little bit of decay, and I tailor this to the tempo of a song just so it sort of extends the decay out from the regular room sound, and it just works to smooth the room sound a little bit, which I like. And just real basic EQ there. And I've got similar things on the mono rooms. We've got a bit of parallel compression and the transient and the tape machine, obviously. So these main effects here are only being sent by the shell. So the kick, snare, and toms are the only ones I send to those effects. I don't really want to add extra compression to my rooms or overheads, and I definitely don't want to add bottom end and body, which is what the tape machine is doing. So yeah, it's just the shells that are being sent to these. Let's just have a listen to what these do to change the mix as well. Okay, this one. So that little bit of edge and transient that's being brought out by that transient plugin, plus there's a little bit of a boost in the top end on this plugin, just adds that little bit of forwardness to the drums in the mix. I think just makes it stand out, and it's especially useful when the music is actually playing. The tape machine, let's have a listen to what that's doing. So you can really hear the body being brought out in those toms. I think I'm sending quite a lot of the toms to the tape machine, yeah. And it is still affecting the kick drum as well. So it's just a nice way to add a little bit of depth and warmth to those drums. It's not a crazy amount of distortion going on either. So it's just trying to provide a bit of body around those drums in the mix. I'm also using the master bus to provide some overall EQ and compression. So I've got a very broad boost in the top ends and mid-range, and taking out some of the mud in the low mids there as well. A small amount of compression is blended in. There's a significant threshold in this one, so we'll be compressing quite a lot, but it's just blended in only about 20%, so not too much. Same with the 1176, got a really fast release on this one, but a lowish ratio and a lowish attack. And lastly, a final EQ on the master bus, boosting some of the top ends and those high mids to sort of make things cut through a little bit. And there's a significant boost in the sort of sub frequencies around 55 to really bring out the kick drum in my mix. Let's just have a listen to what that's doing to the overall mix of the drums. So pretty significant, that one, and you can see how it really changes the overall vibe of the drums and the shape of the drums. And I find it's a really useful way to approach drums is to use bus processing on your master drum bus. It sort of saves you doing a lot of hard work in terms of trying to EQ all the individual elements to create that sound. So it might it might just speed up the process a little bit if you do sort of work a little bit on the master bus processing as you go along. It saves you doing extra work on all these buses or all the individual microphones. I've got the Blackmagic snare as part of my snare stack routed to its own bus here. And the reason for that is I wanted to bring out different characteristics of this snare than what I'm doing to the other two snares going through my main snare bus. I really wanted to bring out the presence and the body in this particular snare drum. So I've got a massive boost around 15 dB at 200 Hertz and a really high boost at around 6K to really bring out the presence of that snare drum, which is it's a little bit different to what I'm doing on these fat snares, which the boost is sort of much lower than the 200. So let's just have a listen to what that's doing to the snare and then listen in the mix as well. So it's really bringing out the presence of that drum. You can really hear the detail in that roll. I like the way the wires sound on this particular snare. So it just really suited to have its own shape and EQ for that particular snare drum. So just quickly on how I've got these snares routed, you might notice here I've got the Blackmagic snare going to the Blackmagic bus here. And I've also got a mahogany set of microphones here. So what these are the direct microphones associated with these two snares. And so just quickly, what Superior Drum will do when you add your snare to a snare stack, it will auto create the direct microphones like this and populate them in your mixer, and then you can choose to route them wherever you want. It might be to the same snare bus or to another one like I've done here. What I've opted to do for two of my snares is just route them to the main snare microphones. So these ones here, which sort of come with the original default preset. And that, of course, is the original snare that I chose, the Zildjian. And I've also chosen to put that Oakle Tree snare to those main snare microphones. And now my two fat, thick snares that are being processed by the main snare bus. And I've explained why the Blackmagic, I've kept its own faders going to its own bus. But I've also done the same thing with the Pearl Mahogany snare. So we can see here it's going to its own direct faders. And what I've done with this one is I've opted to send that straight to the main outputs without any processing, without any compression, any reverb, just a bare minimum of EQ. And the reason for that is I really wanted this snare to provide a natural balance to my overall snare sound. So I've got a lot of compression and transient attack and reverb and tape on my main snares, and I wanted to provide a more natural snare option that I could just blend into the mix to just counterbalance that processed snare sound that I was hearing. So let's just have a listen to what this mahogany snare is doing for the mix. So I just find that it just evens out that compressed sound. It just sort of lets it sit a little bit above that and takes away from the obvious processing that's going on in the snare drum. So just a handy addition to my overall snare sound. I've also got the X faders here that are auto-created by Superior Drummer when I added the Ludwig kick drum to my kick stack. It just gives me control of the direct outputs of this particular drum. I've done a little bit of EQ on some of the individual microphones there, but it's still going to my main kick bus and it's being processed with the other kick drum as well. One of the most powerful features of Superior Drummer 3, which is probably where I get the most creative with my drum sounds, is the bleed from instruments options here in the properties. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to control the level of all your instruments going to this particular microphone. And as you can see, this is my overhead. I've got all my cymbals going to this microphone. I've got all my shells. I've turned the kick drum down a little bit as well. And you can even go into the stacks and choose what amounts of the different instruments in your stacks sending to the microphone. So super powerful. Can seem a little bit daunting and complicated, but I'll go through it. So my main overhead pairs are this overhead stereo. So I want most of my instruments to go through that to provide a natural sounding drum sound. That's pretty straightforward. I've got the same thing going on with the overhead drummer, which is an XY pair over the drums. It's got a good center image. It's the particular microphones give the cymbals a nice sort of sizzly sort of sound. I really like that. So I've put everything's going to those two microphones, and they combine to make my main overhead sound. But what I'm doing is I'm using this bleed from instruments on the overhead tube microphones. And I've opted to just send the shell, so just the toms and the kick and the snare, and I've turned off all the cymbals. So there's no cymbal spill coming from these overhead microphones. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to process this particular microphone set with some pretty severe compression and some EQ, which really enhances the shells in my overall overhead sound. I'll give you a listen to what this sounds like. So you can really hear how that's bringing out the attack and the presence in those shells. And if we combine it with the overheads here, so you can really hear how it gives the shells a lot of presence and clarity within that overhead drum mix. So I really like what that's bringing to that overhead mix. So only really possible through using this bleed from instruments settings. So yeah, really handy to really control what's actually being sent to a particular microphone. Now I'm doing something similar with the rooms. In my main room, it's got all the instruments are being sent there, but I'm turning down all the cymbals, and that's because I'm doing a fair bit of compression on this channel and then again on that room bus. So this just means that I don't get really pumping of cymbals and sort of nasty sound. It's more focused on the actual shells of the drums, which I want to hear in the room space. Same with the ambient far room microphones, a lot of compression, really boosting the bottom end in those EQs. Let's just have a listen to what that's sounding like. But as you can notice in the bleed, I've turned off all the cymbals. So again, this is just focusing on the shells in the room, and I want some body from these. So you can hear that warmth really cutting through for those ones. The ambient booth room, for this one, as you can see, it's just the snare is going to that one. So it's almost just like a room snare sample that I've got going on. It's pretty cool to have control like that. So we listen all together. So you can really hear how those cymbals are just in the background. They're not really interfering too much with the room sound that I'm getting from the shells. So yeah, awesome use for the bleed there. There's one more really cool trick that I've got, which is when I've got a spare microphone that I'm just not using. You can see here the ambient mono's turned down. But often I use it for some of the overheads because there are quite a lot of overheads in the Progressive Foundry. For these overhead ribbons, I'm not really using those for this particular mix. The sound of the microphones isn't quite right for this style of music, but they are there for other styles. But what I've actually opted to do with this set of microphones is just use them for the splash microphone. So in a particular section of the song, let's go to the verse. I think there's one coming up around here. And this set of microphones just picks up the splash cymbal. So essentially it's turning them into a spot microphone. So really useful just to highlight this one cymbal. So you can really hear how now that cymbal cuts through and it's not being interfered with by any of the other drum kit elements that would normally go to that microphone because I turned off. I've done the same thing with the China. which was a overhead mono microphone. I've just relabeled it there. And that's a really cool feature for just really making that particular cymbal stand out. It's the only one going there. I've got a particular EQ on it to really bring focus to that microphone, and I've actually panned it as well. So again, only possible through the bleed from instruments. There's one other really cool feature that I should probably touch on as well. And if we have a quick listen to our kick drum in solo, one of the really cool things, especially for mixing rock and metal, is using the, let's just close these ones, using the envelope releases. So what this does is pretty self-explanatory. I'll just give you a listen. So you can hear it's just changing the envelope release on that sample coming through those microphones, and it's sort of fading off the tail of the note a lot quicker when we go shorter. And it's really useful. It's almost like a gate, sounds a little bit like a gate, and you can use it quite effectively for tightening up drums. So I use it a lot on my floor toms, so pulling out the sustain, the decay of that rumble of a floor tom that I don't want hanging over the next bar of music. So both of those have got it on it, and I find it, a really great tool for tightening drums up, especially for rock and metal mixes. One of the last things I like to experiment with when I'm finishing up a mix in Superior Drummer is to experiment with reintroducing some of the bleed to certain microphones. And the aim of this is to sort of enhance or increase the natural sound of my drum mix. It can definitely be challenging when you're mixing a program to MIDI drums to create a natural sounding drum mix. And I think the ability to do that is all through that bleed from instruments. So it may not be necessary in every style, and depending on the artist you're working with, it might need to be isolated and clean. But I find for music like this and drums like this, it can be really useful to just slightly add a little bit of the bleed to particular microphones. Not enough that's going to unbalance the mix and undo all the hard work you've done, but just to create that sense of realism. So if we listen to this snare track, you can hear there's just a little bit of that spill coming through. And if I apply that to certain microphones, I'll go through an experiment and see what works. Yeah, it'll just create a great natural sounding drum sound. You need to keep an eye on the memory you're using as well, because adding all those spill tracks will increase that memory too. So that about wraps it up for all the mixing techniques and methods I used in Superior Drummer to make this track sound great. There's a bit of an Easter egg for any of you that made it to the end of the video. All the bass you've been hearing is actually coming from Easy Bass, and it's the new metal pack by Toontrack, which I've done a few of the presets on, so make sure you go and check that out as well. I'll just give you a quick listen to it again. So there is no real bass playing on this track through this video. It's all just been this Easy Bass. So let's have a quick listen. So thanks for watching the video. Hopefully there's some mix tips and ideas in there that you can utilize next time you're mixing with Superior Drummer 3.